Well, there was an old tradition among ancient Hebrews that you loved your neighbors and you hated your enemies. And oh, by the way, Israel had lots of enemies. By the time Jesus came on the scene, the number of enemies and the particular enemy for most what I would call fundamentalist Jews, and honestly, the majority of Jews were. There was one group of Jews that you wouldn't be able to say they were fundamentalists, but not in the sense that we might apply the term today to people in America. These were people who organized their lives around the fundamentals of their faith, which they found in the Torah, in the law. Okay. The main enemy? Well, it was Rome. Now, I'm going to take some time because I want us to understand a little bit about the historical context of what Jesus was talking about. We're in Matthew chapter 5, still in the Sermon on the Mount. I know going at a crawling speed, but there's so much there. I mean, well, okay. Israel had been through hundreds of years of conflict and struggle and even oppression. 700 years before Jesus' time, about maybe 600 would be more accurate, they'd gone into captivity by the Babylonians, and then after 70 years they were released to go back to Israel. And then it was off and on being oppressed by a variety of rulers. And so they had this victim mentality. And they, while I suppose in the strictest sense, Rome wasn't holding them captive, but Rome was the ruling government and the ruling power. This didn't go well with Israel, for most of them anyway, and for somewhat good reason, because the Romans were not especially fond of the Jews, and the Romans established governors and kings to do the boots on the ground ruling, and they weren't great people, the majority of them, and for the actual boots on the ground, this would be the Roman legion, Roman soldiers. And one of the worst places to be sent as a Roman soldier was to Israel, mainly Jerusalem. That was the capital city, the hub of Jewish life. And most Roman soldiers were not thrilled to have been assigned there. Compared to the majority of them would have come from the other coast of the Mediterranean, where it wasn't as dry, it wasn't as dusty, it was more beautiful. And even if it wasn't, for the Roman soldier in Jerusalem, they would have thought of it as better. Okay, add all these things in, and Israel felt Rome was the enemy. And At certain times, I have to say, okay, yeah, they did things to Israel that were what an enemy would do. And yet, I don't think, see, the Romans never, in Jesus' time, never prohibited the worship of God. They, Herod, who was the designated ruler, had even built a third temple that was, well, it was very splendid and impressive. Well, he hadn't done it because of his religious conviction. He had done it because of his pride, but still, Israel was permitted to worship. And they, although, yeah, the taxation issue was problematic, to say the least, where the tax gatherer, the tax collector, was pretty much, here's what you will send back to Rome. Anything beyond that is up to you. Well, you'd think the IRS is the Roman taxation was not fair. There was nothing equal about it. So Israel felt Rome was their enemy. So they were to love their neighbor, their Jewish neighbor. And they could hate their enemy. In fact, you should hate your enemy. They're your enemy, for crying out loud. Well, in verse 44, Jesus says, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Wait a second. Wait. Can you hear the Israelite kind of, I mean, that would, how could that not be their first response? Love my enemy? No. My grandpappy and then my dad, they taught me, your enemy is your enemy. You love your neighbor, your Jewish neighbor, but you hate your enemy. You despise them. And now Jesus totally flips the script. Love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, or the old King James says, who spitefully use you. Ooh, this, as countercultural as his teaching had been up to this point in this sermon, this, I think, was the biggest, in a way, it was an assault on normal Jewish life. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. How do I love my enemy? Let's define love. I've talked about this a bunch of times already, but my favorite definition of love comes from my friend B.A. Austin. And he said, love is doing for the other person what they really need. You think about an enemy. What do they really need? Well, the enemy, in our day, the enemy might say, I need more weaponry. Is that what they really need? I don't think so. I mean, I think I can make a case that if we provide our enemy with weapons, that's not turning the other cheek. That's just opening the front door and saying, here, handcuff me and drag me away. What do our enemies most need? Or you can think military and political enemy. But and at times that's kind of fun, right? Okay. But what about, do you have a personal enemy? Now, that it won't be an extreme thing. I don't think for most of us. It might be only someone in our life who is are in an adversarial role. They they just, maybe it's a person in your work that just is always against everything you bring up, everything you're doing. They want you to fail. It happens. And oh, by the way, it even happens in churches. All right, on that level, I suppose I could say they're an enemy. Well, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to love them. How do I seek out for them and do for them what I can for what they really need? Now there's a big, long discourse that could go on here. So what do they really need? Well, one of the things that everybody needs, I don't care who you are, I don't care what your political persuasion is or your religious inclination or not, every human being needs to feel valued. And it's interesting, when that need is not being addressed, we tend to go to extremes. One extreme is, I will treat myself as more valuable than the rest of those, peons and idiots. Okay, that's that. Pardon me. It can be sparked and fed by what I think C.S. Lewis called it the worst of sins, and I agree, pride. Okay, but then there's this other side where they feel horrible. I mean, they don't count. They're why would my opinion matter? I'm worthless. I know that. So we have people who overvalue themselves and people who undervalue themselves, and they both have the same need. They need to feel valued. And only God can provide that kind of valued opinion. Well, okay, so I guess it sounds very churchy, but the biggest thing that my enemy needs is God at work in their life. How can I do that for them? No. But, this is ugly, but there are a lot of times when I have been a hindrance to people experiencing God's presence in their life because I've tried to be God. I've tried to dominate. I've tried to push them into what I want. You probably haven't, but I have. I'm trying to weed that out of my life. What do people most need? That's a great question to ask. When you encounter an adversarial individual, my first inclination has always been, all right, how can I put them in their place? I'm going to win this. Well, is it possible that the first thing that I ought to dwell on is what is the need that's not being met or even being addressed in their life? And is there anything I can do toward that? Loving my enemy is not easy. It goes against the grain of my nature. But that doesn't exempt me from following Christ and obeying his words. Love your enemy. Well, there's a lot more to say about this, so I'll have to come back to it next time on So Care with Stevie.